They say that on a blazing afternoon in the ancient Mediterranean, the sea itself seemed to catch fire. Enemy ships, their wooden hulls creaking, bore down upon the great city of Syracuse, only to burst into sudden, impossible flames. The legend tells us it wasn't the gods who struck them down, nor lightning from the sky, but a man. A mind so sharp, so impossibly ahead of his time, that he could turn sunlight into a weapon. His name was Archimedes, and what he may have created is one of the most debated mysteries in all of history, the so-called death ray. Now, whether you believe it or not, well, that's the question, isn't it? Let's begin not with a weapon, but with a man. Imagine Syracuse in the 3rd century BCE, a glittering jewel of Greek culture on the island of Sicily. The harbor smells of salt and olives. The marketplace hums with traders speaking Greek, Latin, and Punic. But above the noise, above the heat of the day, somewhere in a quiet courtyard, sits Archimedes. He's not a warrior. He's not even particularly interested in politics. He's a thinker, a mathematician, an engineer, a man obsessed with numbers, levers, and the hidden laws of the physical world. But history and fate would force his genius onto the battlefield. The year is 214 BCE. The Second Punic War is raging, and the Roman Republic has turned its eyes toward Syracuse, a city allied with Carthage. The Romans arrive not as guests, but as besiegers, their ships bristling with soldiers, siege engines, and the confidence of an empire in the making. Syracuse's walls are strong, yes, but not invincible, and so the city's defense falls to its greatest mind. Archimedes had already earned a reputation as a master of war machines, massive catapults that could hurl stones farther than the enemies, cranes that could lift and tip attacking ships into the sea. The Romans would later write, with grudging admiration, that his devices alone kept their navy at bay for years. But among these feats, one story shines brighter, or perhaps more blindingly, than all the rest. The story goes that Archimedes devised a way to harness the very light of the sun to set the Roman ships aflame. The accounts vary, but the most common version paints this scene. On the city walls, Archimedes instructs a group of soldiers to hold large, polished bronze or copper mirrors. Together, they angle them toward a single enemy vessel. The Mediterranean sun, intense and unyielding, reflects from dozens of surfaces into a single point on the ship's hull. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, smoke begins to curl upward. The pitch that seals the planks starts to bubble. And then, flames leap to life, licking up the mast, spreading with the wind. From the Roman perspective, this must have been nothing short of sorcery. Fire from nowhere, a fleet undone not by swords but by light. But here's the thing. Was it real? This is where the mystery begins to twist. We know Archimedes was a genius. We know Syracuse held out against Rome's siege for years thanks largely to his inventions. But the earliest detailed accounts of the so-called death ray don't appear until centuries later. Historians like Lucian of Samosata in the 2nd century CE and later writers in the Byzantine period mention it, long after Archimedes himself was gone. Plutarch, writing a century after Archimedes, speaks of him using weapons of incredible ingenuity against the Romans, but says nothing about a death ray. Was it a forgotten truth or a later embellishment? Let's pause for a moment and picture it in practice. You're standing on the sun-drenched walls of Syracuse, a dozen or more soldiers beside you. Each man holds a mirror, perhaps polished bronze shields gleaming like molten gold. The sea dazzles in the heat. You squint, sweating under the glare, as you try to keep your beam aimed at a moving ship, its oars churning the water. Could you really set it aflame before it's too close to matter? Or would the Romans already be scaling the walls? Modern scientists have asked the same question. In 1973, the Greek scientist Ioannis Sakas staged an experiment at the naval base of Skaramagas. Using 70 polished copper mirrors, he directed sunlight onto a wooden boat about 160 feet away. The result? Within minutes, the boat's pine planks began to smoke, and then ignited. It seemed the death ray might be possible after all, at least under perfect conditions. But then came the skeptics. In 2005, the TV show Mythbusters tried to recreate the death ray using a formation of mirrors aimed at a ship's hull. They found it extremely difficult to concentrate enough heat on a single spot for long enough to cause ignition, especially with a moving target and less than perfect weather. They labeled the myth busted. Yet, after tweaking their methods in later episodes, they managed to produce small flames. Not conclusive proof, but enough to reopen the debate. So which is it? History is rarely kind enough to give us a clean answer. Some scholars argue the death ray is pure legend, perhaps inspired by tales of Archimedes' other inventions. Others suggest it might have been more of a dazzling weapon, using mirrors to blind enemy sailors, forcing them to shield their eyes and lose coordination as catapults and arrows rain down. And then there are those who believe in a middle ground, that Archimedes may have experimented with focused sunlight, finding it impractical in most situations, but memorable enough that later storytellers elevated it into a full-blown weapon of war. Here's another wrinkle: the psychology of legend. Human beings love stories of impossible genius, of the lone mind outsmarting overwhelming force. The Romans were embarrassed by how long it took them to conquer Syracuse. Imagine how much easier it would be to explain that embarrassment if they could blame it on some miraculous, otherworldly invention. And then there's the matter of Archimedes himself. He was, by all accounts, humble and intensely private, more interested in solving problems than in basking in fame. When the Romans finally breached the city in 212 BCE, the general Marcellus reportedly ordered that Archimedes be spared. But in the chaos, he was killed. Accounts vary on whether it was by a soldier's sword or in some accident. What's striking is that in his lifetime, no one seems to have recorded this death ray. The first whispers of it come long after his death, when he could no longer confirm or deny it. Still, there's something haunting about the image, isn't there? Sunlight, gathered and turned into a spear of fire, striking from the safety of the walls. It's the kind of weapon that feels both ancient and futuristic, the kind of idea that reminds us how thin the line can be between myth and science. If we strip the story down to its bones, here's what we know. Archimedes was capable of creating extraordinary machines far ahead of his time. The physics of concentrating sunlight to ignite flammable material is sound. We do it on a small scale with magnifying glasses even today. Under perfect conditions, with enough mirrors, enough manpower, and a stationary target, it could work. But war, as history shows us, is anything but perfect. And perhaps that's the beauty of the legend. It doesn't matter if it was ever deployed exactly as the storytellers claim. The death ray endures because it represents the ultimate victory of intellect over brute force, the idea that a single mind could harness the natural world in ways that armies could barely comprehend. Standing here, metaphorically, on the warm stones of those ancient walls, I can almost hear the shouts from the harbor, the creak of Roman oars, the sharp gleam of sunlight in the corner of my eye. Was it just the glint of shields? Or something more deliberate, more dangerous? Somewhere between the known and the imagined, between the calculations of physics and the shimmer of legend, lies the truth. And maybe, just maybe, the truth is less important than the inspiration. Because even if Archimedes never truly burned ships with sunlight, his story still burns bright over 2,000 years later. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of one of history's most enduring mysteries. Now, I'd like to ask you, if the death ray were possible, do you think Archimedes would have used it in battle? Or was it more likely an invention of later storytellers? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, please like, comment, and share. It truly helps keep these stories alive.